Today, I welcome on the show Dr. Will Cole, who joins us for his third episode since we started the podcast a few years ago. And this time we talk a lot about fasting. Doc just wrote a new book called Intuitive Fasting. So we chat a lot about intuitive eating, intuitive fasting, as he proclaims in the book, and a bunch of other things around how people should be approaching their health from a more holistic way. So always good to chat with Dr. Will Cole here, and today is no exception. This episode is brought to you by Element, or LMNT, which is an electrolyte beverage brand founded by Rob Wolf, Luis Villasenor, and Tyler Cartwright. 2 of 3 of those guys have actually been on the show to talk about why they started this company and their background in this space. But mainly they have worked with literally thousands of people. And these are some of the most qualified experts that I learned a lot from in the early days of when I was doing keto and helping research and help a lot of people. And the number one thing that these guys saw was that people were having an extremely hard time switching to low carb because they were simply not getting enough electrolytes. But as you guys know, I often complain about the supplement industry is full of absolute trash, that people using artificial ingredients, fillers, sugar, etc. And they could not find an electrolyte that met their standards, not only from lack of ingredients, but not having the highest amount of sodium, potassium, and magnesium that they thought needed to exist in certain ratios. So they launched Element, and I drink them myself daily. So I've been a long time user basically since the first day they launched. And whenever I go back to eating keto or lower carb after eating moderate amount of carbs, I need these things at least a couple times a day, or else I feel like crap, especially in the summertime here in Austin, Texas, where it's 150 degrees every single day. And I'm working out outside, playing basketball, hanging out with friends, and sweating my face off. I typically have up to 4 of these in a day. My favorite is the citrus salt, which is the original one, but the raspberry and habanero are also my favorites as well. So if you guys want to hear more about Element and my favorites and why I use it, head on over to drinklmnt.com/TNSP. That's drinklmnt.com/TNSP. Dr. Will Cole here again for round 3.
Wow, I said it 3 times.
Yeah. I mean, the first time was like 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
I launched the podcast. I think it's still in San Francisco, actually. So I had been over.
Yes, you were. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited. I want to be the guest that comes on most often. Am I first place yet?
I think Ruscio is also at 3 times.
Right,
Paul's at Saladino's at 3 times.
Okay.
So I think
I'm a good company with those 2 guys, but I'll let it be.
Well, you guys are, I think, just you find an area and you just gobble up and continue to learn. And I think that you always have new stuff to share. So I was excited to have you guys back.
Thank you.
So we're talking a little bit before the podcast started about things that you're into a lot lately. I think the intuition around eating. You have a new book called Intuitive Fasting coming out, but this is a concept that I don't think a lot of people understand. I think there's a lot of thresholds here around, I don't know your perspective, we'll dig into it, but I don't think it's really possible to eat intuitively if you're eating a standard American diet. There's like some triggers to get back. And then once you start feeding your body real food, it's like, oh, this nutrient goes here and this thing does that thing. Then you can start being more intuitive. So just love to hear about your concept around intuitive eating, intuitive fasting, and sort of letting the body speak for itself.
Yeah, I think the title of the book really came from, I obviously on a superficial level, I'm the play on words of intermittent and intuitive, and the paradox of that. Like on a superficial level, how could fasting ever be intuitive? How could anyone ever be just intuitively not eating? And that is a paradox for people that are metabolically inflexible. And it's really nice when you see on social media these nice soundbitey, clickbait, sexy sounding things like intuitive eating, but there's never ever any definition around it. And even if there is a definition around it, what does that really look like on a practical level for most people around the world? Because like you mentioned, any of my patients when they're first meeting me at the beginning of their health journey, struggling with inflammation, struggling with hormone imbalance, struggling with blood sugar problems. Is it intuition or hangriness? Is it intuition or hormone imbalance? Like stress eating, emotional eating is not intuitive eating. When you're in the throes of that imbalance, and chronic inflammation is an immune imbalance. That imbalance is proverbial noise in the body. It's going to be very difficult to discern what your body loves and what it doesn't love, and proper signaling pathways as far as hunger and satiety. So I think intuitive eating is the goal, and that's where I want people to get to. But you actually have to put in the work and the time to build the metabolic flexibility to have proper discernment, have balance and a solid foundation on a physiological level. So that's what intuitive fasting is all about. It's how can we use flexible intermittent fasting, vacillating, ebbing and flowing, eating and fasting windows to gain metabolic flexibility. So it's just born out of my clinical experience of seeing patients and using these tools in a way that moves the labs in a positive direction, moving their quality of life, moving how they feel in a positive direction. So that's what I'm exploring in the book.
Yeah. So in your experience, what are some of those things that you mentioned? I mean, you mentioned a few different things with blood sugar, metabolic flexibility, et cetera. Like, how do you quantify these things with your patients and give people sort of a guide of, okay, if we see this marker, if you respond to these foods, we can assume that you're not metabolically flexible and that you need to go on some sort of protocol. And so how do people know that they're metabolically inflexible versus flexible? And if they can sort of like edge more towards a intuitive style of eating?
So there's both subjective and objective ways that we can look at it from this. For patients, we're looking at things like hemoglobin A1C. We want that in functional medicine to be under 5.4. We want triglycerides to be under 100, circulating fat. Above 100 is kind of one way to show that the body's storing glucose as circulating fats. It's a storage adaptation. We look at liver enzymes too. Spiked liver enzymes can be a sign of fatty liver problems, which is a hallmark sign of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. So looking at serum fasting glucose, of course, under 90, we want that to be under 90 in functional medicine too. So those are like the basic metabolic markers. I want to look at inflammation markers too. So making sure high sensitivity C-reactive protein is under 1. I want to look at methylation in general terms as a baseline, looking at homocysteine. Under 7, as another inflammatory marker there. And then we can get a little bit granular with patients and run things like the nuclear magnetic resonance NMR test to look at the subfractionation of lipids. We're going to make sure the small dense LDL particles are lower. They're in pattern A, which is the non-oxidized and non-inflamed particles. Think of like fluffy, buoyant, like protective cotton balls that are just as good as HDL and behave a lot like HDL as far as being cardioprotective. So we want to put all of that into context. So if those numbers are off or any of those other numbers are off, that's some good evidence that the person's metabolically inflexible or metabolically rigid. They're in this various forms of sugar burning mode. And another a subjective way to look at this is I put a quiz in intuitive fasting, which is adapted from questions that I ask patients during a health history. So I'm just taking them through a functional medicine approach to understanding metabolic flexibility. So before we even run labs, I'm typically asking these questions that I adapted for the quiz, so they can get more or less, are they fully flexible? Are they fairly flexible? Are they not so flexible? And then that's our baseline. So I would look at both. I mean, obviously for the context of the reader, not everybody's going to have the labs ran, even though they could. But the quiz is at least a good ballpark metric of saying, this is my baseline, this is what I'm up against, and let's compare and contrast this over these 4-week cycles that I have people doing in the book.
Yeah. So the quiz is probably like what, energy, cravings, things like that. Like what's contained in the quiz?
Yeah, so it's going through these. That's a good, definitely a good one that's in there is cravings. Do you crave foods a lot? Do you crave sugar? Do you kind of live on caffeine and sugar? Do you get an afternoon lull in energy and you get a second wind in the evening? Do you feel like you have to take a nap? If you miss a meal, do you feel shaky, irritable? Are you hangry? Mood swings, trouble losing weight, other signs of chronic inflammation. Those are things that we're digging into on the quiz.
And then as far as looking at this again, like, okay, somebody now is metabolically flexible and can start eating intuitively. Like, do you think that, fasting and eating can be approached in more of an intuitive way? And if so, like, what are the foundations of that? Like, I've always thought, like, you can't eat intuitively if you're eating any sort of refined foods.
Mm-hmm.
You're sending weird signals to the brain, like even cooking and combining certain things like carbs and fat, even if it's potatoes and butter and salt. I think that even screws up with some intuition around what people should eat. So I'm just curious in your take.
Yeah. I mean, I pair the vacillating, I put together a 4-week cycle of fasts that I want people to do. And they cycle through the 4 weeks as many times as they need to based on when they're starting out. I mean, I realize just like when my patients are starting out at different points of their journey, so is the reader. So I want people to reevaluate after 4 weeks, but most people are going to need multiple cycles to really gain metabolic flexibility. And they can check in and retake that quiz as many times as they need to every 4 weeks. So without a doubt, I'm not advocating it as a functional medicine practitioner. I'm not advocating people to fast their way out of a poor diet, even though if you look at the research and for research purposes, for controlled for calories and for there's no change in the diet, they wanted to prove, multiple studies have shown that you don't really have to change your diet that much, and you don't have to decrease your calories to really see the benefits of time restricted feeding, which is that specific type of intermittent fasting that I'm exploring in intuitive fasting. But that's for research purposes. And that's to show, does this stand on its own? Does fasting stand on its own? And we know that it does. But it is exponentially amplified when you're focusing on nutrient dense foods. And that's really such an other side of the coin that you have to look at. You can't just deal with the fasting. You have to look at what's working synergistically, what's working in congruency with the fast. So a clean, whole foods based ketogenic diet is, as you know, I mean, the expert in the space, but that for people that don't know, I mean, that both the ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting is both supporting beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body that is very much a part of metabolic flexibility. For somebody to get that log on the fire, to be more sustainably burning, and not just a way to burn fat, but it's a signaling molecule, meaning it does really cool things for our health. And we want to be supporting that to lower inflammation, to improve brain function, to increase autophagy, all these things that I need to be building for the patient or the person that's reading the book. I want them to build for themselves to gain metabolic flexibility. So yeah, I'm using a cyclical ketogenic diet, a cyclical ketotarian diet specifically. So it's kind of in many ways part 2 of Ketotarian, my first book, but it stands on its own. But it's definitely a way to amplify that clean ketogenic diet to the next level.
Yeah, right. So when are times that people shouldn't be fasting? I mean, this is like people look at fasting and they go, oh, well, it's good. I hear about it in the news headlines. I should just do it and I should max it out. Just like how people like to take things to the extreme. So just curious in your perspective of when to use this, and if like focusing on getting metabolically flexible first and then going to fasting, like how you think about
the way that I put in the plan, it's 4 weeks, but it's self-paced. So I'm having this conversation with the reader throughout the book that if they get through week 1, I think there's going to be some people who read the book that are really metabolically inflexible that they would benefit from repeating week 1 over 2 or 3 weeks. So week 1 is a 12-12 fasting to eating window. It's very basic, but it's very appreciated oftentimes because there's a lot of compelling research around a 12-12 fasting to eating window, but we're pairing that with a clean ketotarian diet. So you're supporting beta hydroxybutyrate and lowering inflammation, working on this, eating these nutrient dense foods. And you're doing that for week 1. Now, let's just say that was difficult for somebody, even eating between 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and having basically all day to eat. And you're just basically not eating too late and you're fasting through the night until you break the fast at breakfast. There's going to be some people that would benefit from having that 12-12 fasting to eating time restricted feeding window for 2 or 3 weeks. But I want people that are cool with that. They're progressing, they're improving, they're getting more metabolically flexible to go right into week 2 if they're cool with that. So they have to check in with their energy levels, check in with their digestion, check in with their sleep, check in with all these things that I'm reminding them over the course of these 4 weeks. Week 2 is about an 18-hour fast. So it's about a 12, if that's for an example, 12 to 6 eating window or 18-hour fast, 24 hours. So you can put that 6 hours wherever you want to, but that's typically what I do when I'm consulting patients. So we're doing that over week 2. The week 3 is a bit deeper. It's an almost OMAD approach. It's 1 meal a day, time restricted feeding. So
is that every day, or is that certain days in a week? How do you think about it?
We're doing it every other day that week. You could do it every day. I mean, I've done it every day, but I wanted people to have their refeeding times alternating. So we're vacillating in week 3. We're working on deeper ketosis, doing an OMAD and then a 12-12, an OMAD and a 12-12, OMAD and a 12-12 in week 3, with no clean carb up days. So I'm exploring through the book this cyclical ketotarian approach for women and people that are high performance athletes or just want more carbohydrates. So we can use these tools. Because in week 4, we're opening it back up to 12-12. It's a bigger eating window with more clean carb cycling. And the people that are dealing with more metabolic issues, they can do less clean carb cycling. People that are maybe leaner, have low thyroid issues, they can clean carb cycle, or women around their periods or ovulation, they can clean carb cycle more. So I'm strategizing these tools. So to your point, and I think it's a really good point to make, is that you have all these factions, you have all these tribal opinions in the health space that say, well, fasting's not good for women, or, and then you have the fasting community that's like, fasting is like, the more fasting, the better. The truth is oftentimes somewhere in the middle, and the context matters here, is that you can use all these amazing tools like keto, like fasting, like carb cycling, and let's mash them in a way that works in context with the person that's doing them. So I'm having conversations to the reader throughout the book that just what I've seen clinically over the years of, if you're this type of person, you're going to tend to do better with more of this and less of that, and then vice versa, depending on who you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think we are at a point in our society where we like things either black or white, and the truth seems to be always in the middle and requires some nuance. And so, I mean, that's been my filter lately of people who I just want to engage with, or people who can hold two simultaneous ideas in their head at once, two conflicting ideas, and see like, okay, where is the middle ground here, and how does that apply to very specific situations? And I mean, that's what a good clinician should be doing at all times. And the whole blanket approach of, oh, fasting is great, everybody should just do it in 1 meal a day, or like, oh, nobody should do fasting because it kills everybody. It's like, okay, both of these can be true depending on the individual. And then there's a huge gray area in between. And I mean, one of the things that I've seen a lot with fasting generally is that the more extreme a person gets with it, out of the gate, it correlates to personality type. And people who are generally, sleeping way less because they want to get more work done, working out ultra hard, and then fasting, like basically putting all this stress in their body. And they're like, the allostatic load of the current stress they have is just insane. And I think like, if you're waking up and shooting coffee down and like immediately working, these are just some signals to me that fasting is actually probably not best for these type of people. I don't know if you've seen this more like behaviorally, like a behavior, but like if you're waking up, you have a nice morning routine, you're starting it out, like you're not addicted to your phone, you're not super type A trying to train for an Ironman while you're also running several companies. Like these type of people, I found fasting to be completely detrimental for. I don't know what your experience has been.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think really exploring the impact that stress has, and it like somebody's headspace and heart space, like that, these oftentimes non-directly measurable things will, without a doubt, produce a completely different outcome. It's so interesting to see, like, even if labs look relatively the same and the person's goals are relatively the same, their baseline is relatively the same, but somebody's headspace, someone has a positive mental state, somebody has a really unhealthy, whether that's some toxic stress or trauma that they haven't worked out, or it's just chronic stress because they're busy and they're type A, like you were saying. You're definitely right. Though the trauma, stress, workaholic, they tend to be slower movers in recovering because of that. So I think that's one of the reasons why throughout intuitive fasting, I'm bringing in these, what I call in the book, metaphysical meals, like these acts of stillness where you have to cultivate something. So what are you doing when you're not eating? What are you doing when you are doing your fasts? And I'm advocating for people to bring things that activate that parasympathetic resting and digesting state in their body. Because you're right, if you're fasting through this super stressful life, even if you like the stress, if it's excessive, constant stress, you're never giving your body a time to fully repair. And fasting is already a slight hormetic effect on the body. So if you want to leverage the benefits of hormesis, this good stress, but not on top of the mental, emotional, lifestyle stress that people are going through. So they have to down-regulate their stress as much as they can, while leveraging the benefits of the slight hormetic stressful effect of the fast to really move the needle in a significant way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think we've talked about before, I don't know if it's on podcast or not, but just seeing the amount of awareness increasing right now. I mean, you say like, yes, this is obvious stress of just normal day-to-day life, but the undercurrent of trauma and dealing with that and having a mental space where like, this is very tough to do. Like we're still very early stages, but I'm seeing sort of like everybody that's working at the edge of functional medicine trying to combine now, like, okay, how do we get mental health to where we need it? How have you worked with your patients to sort of assess, okay, you're dealing with something a little bit more than just a physical thing here? I mean, I've talked about it on my podcast a lot, so people who are listening should be a little bit familiar with this, but the amount that emotional health and mental health from previous trauma in life can block you from progressing in physical health is pretty dramatic. And it like has to be integrated with what people are doing to treat the human as a whole. Like you can't ignore this and expect somebody to get totally better. So just curious of your experience with that and like how you started to integrate it over the last few years as it's becoming more and more of a focus area.
It is. Yeah. It's always been a major part of my work. And it's just for me to always remind myself that I can't just look at the labs, because we run all these comprehensive labs in functional medicine. Sometimes you can get so myopic in all those physiological things, but always vetting. And that's why case review meetings are so important. Like me and my team, like just constantly looking at all the seen and the unseen components to why somebody feels the way that they do, and understanding the context of the person who got those labs, and and using their real life as a lab in many ways of just sort of understanding the nuance of their life. So it is without a doubt a very important component for anybody struggling with chronic health problems. And it's on that spectrum. It doesn't have to be a major health problem necessarily for these non-lab lifestyle, mental, emotional things that are impacting their physiology itself. So that's that bidirectional relationship between thoughts and emotions and our physiology, because our thoughts and emotions impact our physiology, but our physiology also impacts our thoughts and emotions too. So you have to look at both sides of the coin there. And looking at one side of the coin is not the full picture. So you have people in the mental health space that are just looking at the thoughts and emotions, but they're not realizing that if you have underlying gut problems or hormonal imbalances or chronic inflammation, chronic infection, co-infections, all of that stuff will drive anxiety and depression. And there's research that show that. It's the cytokine model of cognitive function. It's looking at how cytokines, pro-inflammatory cells, are impacting anxiety and depression and fatigue, all that stuff. So you have to deal with the physiological stuff to deal with the anxiety and the depression. And mental health is physical health. It's not separate from physical health. So understanding the neuroinflammatory components, the brain inflammation components to these things. But conversely, people in the functional medicine space, people in the, even the traditional medicine space, they don't realize the impact that trauma can have and stress can have, or an unhealthy circumstance in their life or some loss that they've had in their life that needs to be worked with. So it depends on what they're up against, but it really is me as a functional medicine practitioner, either bringing tools in their life that will bring active stillness, so really coaching them on mindfulness meditation, really working on things as simple as telling them I was prescribing forest bathing. I mean, the research coming out of Japan and South Korea, the Shinrin-yoku, and it's not just hiking through the woods, which has its benefits, of course, but it's actually using nature as a meditation and having that experience. These very low-cost, free things that I can do from my side of things, and giving people resources and guiding them through tools that I know can move the needle for them to start to heal. But then there's, without a doubt, times very commonly with my patient base, I deal a lot with autoimmune patients, that we refer out to trauma specialists, that they're working with them in conjunction with us to really work through these issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think that as it becomes more popular, think like this, it's easier to work through. However, it's so tough because we're still at a stage where we can't quantify these things. Mm-hmm. And, we can get labs, we can even look at a person and see physical signs, and they're easy to measure. You can take photos of people, but there are no objective measures of the trauma or emotional or mental health of somebody. I mean, I think we'll get there at some point. I think we'll eventually be able to have a brain scan and say, oh, okay, this part of the brain is not firing because of whatever reason. And mm-hmm. we'll be able to put some of these things together. But right now, we basically have no tools. Yeah. And so it's really challenging to say like, oh, this is working better for this person. I mean, there's so many different ways to go about it as well. Meditation, journal, talk therapy, psychedelics. Like there's so many different avenues. I'm sure just like with other interventions, like it just is different for the person, but to not be able to quantify it. I mean, I've worked through a lot of stuff in my life as well. It's like, you don't really know until it's like such a soft change that it's really hard to also appreciate improving in developing in this way as well. I mean, it's just like, I think the biggest problem, and it's just like social media has been insane over the last couple of months, but the last few weeks especially. Mm-hmm. And just seeing the amount of people who are reacting to things in such an aggressive way. And they think that someone else is shaming someone else. And so then they personally attack this other person. It's like mm-hmm. Martha, my fiance, is like, she does all this work. She has this platform called How We Get Along, which is basically like how people should treat themselves. It's like her philosophy is that people should work on themselves before, they're trying to work on any other relationship dynamics. And she made a good point the other day. She's like, basically, people who are engaging online in really aggressive and attacking ways, not trying to be compassionate or understanding, are just the people who are hurting the most that don't know it yet. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's sad because that's a lot of people. And like these people who are like mentally unwell, emotionally unwell, and just have no idea, zero idea.
You're absolutely right. I think that, and I think you look at the statistics of brain health / mental health issues, things like anxiety and depression and fatigue, and even the far-reaching spectrum of these problems, they have grown by leaps and bounds since the onset of social media. So that they're intertwined, and people have this false sense of connection, but it's actually really not that authentic, or it's very unhealthy and toxic and compulsive. So it's something that, I mean, that's part of protocols that I put patients on too. It's just detaching from so much technology, having healthy parameters around it, because you have these unfettered, unchecked things where people are just binging on all types of technology, in part to distract themselves because it feels good to numb and have that dopamine spike, but it is not good for their overall well-being long-term. And I think when you look at the tribalism that you mentioned there, like where people are shaming people or really trolling everybody and being really caustic in many ways, it's so easy to be that keyboard warrior and say something horrible because there's no connection, and you can say really nasty things that most of these people wouldn't be able to say face to face. And also there's this breeding ground for confirmation bias. I think that's a problem today, where you're only seeking out information to confirm things you already believe in. And that just creates this sort of cult-like tribal mentality that is ugly on all different levels. And that could be something as simple as health tribalism and confirmation bias, but obviously political can get even uglier.
Yeah, I mean, I see this all the time in the health industry, where you get someone who's vegan versus someone who's carnivore. So you get people on two ends of the spectrum, and I'm arguing and attacking each other. And I'm just like, you guys are like, 95% of Americans eat a standard American diet eating processed food. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter which way people go here, like vegan or carnivore or anything in between. This is going to be so much better than what the majority of people are doing. Like, you're not helping. Like, we need to work together here. Yeah. And respect that, like, there's, like we said before, fasting all the time or never fasting, and then some sort of nuance in between for the individual. Same thing with real food eating. Like, I have opinions, but it doesn't mean like I still say like, okay, if you're going to be 100% vegan and do it right with supplementation, that is so much better if you're eating the real local seasonal foods than some, like if you go to a random grocery store in a large city right now and look what people are putting in their grocery carts, you cannot argue with me that that is a non-ideal diet comparatively.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely true. And I think hopefully more and more people will come to that space in the health space to not add to the noise, because really it's no good. Like, we should be the agents for positive change in the world. Being in health and wellness, we should be the light instead of adding to the darkness and adding to the tribalism. Because if you're fighting about food, I mean, we are in a sad state of affairs as humanity if we can't even get along over food and somebody's health. We should be coming together and have different opinions and educate people about the bioavailability of nutrients and the impact that we've seen clinically. Like, absolutely talk about it, but it doesn't have to get so negative sometimes. But I do, in many ways, I see it. Maybe I'm in my bubble and I don't really look at things that much. Just when I'm consulting people, I don't look at it as much as I used to. But I feel like it's gotten a little bit better in the health space. I feel like there were a couple, and maybe it's still bad in the big factions. I know the vegan, they're some of the most toxic people, oftentimes the most militant. But I feel like the carnivore space and the keto space has actually gotten more inclusive and have more of a nuanced perspective, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I think it's tough whenever you wrap in morality and judgment into any movement, nutrition or otherwise. And I think that, like, that snuck into the vegan movement like a long time ago regarding, oh, you're killing something, and like that judgment-based morality argument. I think it was hard. Like, you just get so identified with the actual choice of foods. I mean, I'm looking at, like, there's obviously very great, like, I don't know a lot of the top vegan people, but I mean, there's obviously great people in the space who aren't like that. But whenever you wrap that stuff in, it can get a little out of control. But yeah, I mean, this is something like it. I think it's, I mean, I was doing a really big annual review in the start of the year, end of last year. And it's not easy to reflect on what you think and believe and challenge your own assumptions. It sucks. It's not fun. I do this like pretty much every month, quarter, year. Like, oh, is this still what I want? Is this still what I believe? Can I be wrong about some stuff? Like, what is going on? It's uncomfortable to sit with that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't like, just they have no habit around it. We don't have anything in our society that pushes people to have to face their own sort of beliefs and constructs that they've made for themselves. I think it would do everyone service to be able to, like, take some space, have some silence, think about, like, oh, how do I think about the world? And is there a different way to think about it?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think it's a perfect antidote to confirmation bias and these tribalism that's really hurting the world. It's not actually helping anybody. Because you mentioned, like, these Twitter wars or these social media wars or the comment section on certain Instagram posts. Like, does that really change the hearts and minds of anybody? Is that, like, if you are really passionate and believe whatever thing you're talking about, whether it's a way of eating or political ideology or some whatever, I would be very surprised if that comment section that you think you're going back and forth with somebody, or that tweet, is really going to change and, like, be like, oh, wow, I'm going to do what they say now, because it's going to turn most people off or confuse them, and they're not going to know what to believe. You're actually not going to get to the heart of what that person actually wants, which is for people to see what you're saying as having truth into it and actually changing their hearts and minds. You have to go about it a completely different way. I see that with patients. You cannot shame anybody. You cannot shame them into health. You cannot be punitive and arduous and dogmatic and get an outcome that you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes two to tango and a lot of things in life. And this is one of the things, like, someone needs to be open to receiving new ideas. And you also need to be respectful about delivering them and being understanding for where someone's at. Which you seem to, like, you do a phenomenal job with this online, especially with, like, your social media and stuff like that. Like, where did you learn these skills? They're not something that were taught early on. Like, you seem to be a master of them.
Thanks. I mean, it's nothing. I don't even know. I like teaching people. And I just have have a compassionate heart, I guess, towards people. And a lot of my job is educating people. But I know to truly educate and empower somebody, you're going to have to do it with the love and grace and meet them where they're at. So I need to know, as a functional medicine practitioner, not just what's clinically relevant. But you mentioned Paul Saladino, who's a great guy. I use clean carnivore protocols for patients. So just to use health as an example, people that need carnivore protocols for a time, if they're in tons of food sensitivities, ton of reactions, and I know for a time having a specific finite carnivore-ish protocol or carnivore protocol for a time to downregulate that inflammation and then slowly reintroduce foods out of it for long-term sustainability, microbiome, all that stuff that I want to be supporting. I have the intellectual flexibility to use protocols that work for that person for a time. But let's just say that person, it would be clinically relevant for them on paper, but their headspace, they're not there. So you have to not only know what's clinically on paper, something that could move the needle, but how can you meet them where they're at? How can you be there for them in the way that they're even looking for? And that's that duality of what we do in functional medicine. It's the science and then the art. And the art of it is they're not ready for this deeper protocol. How do you, like you said, move the needle in a positive direction, but still make this sustainable and realistic for them? So I think it's probably, to answer your question, I think it's just me talking to people for 10 hours a day for the past 11, 12 years. And hearing every excuse under the book, seeing every type of variables of labs into the book, and making these things make sense long term for people has bled out onto social media. And that's a bad use of words, but it's kind of infused in all different ways that I communicate with people.
What are some things that you've changed your mind on over the last, I don't know, 8 months, 12 months since we had a podcast? Just curious, are you I've changed my opinion on X, Y, or Z?
Not much with as far as functional medicine. I've gone deeper, I guess. I haven't changed my mind, but I've just been deeper dive researching on things like trauma. We mentioned that, but really digging into the massive, far-reaching implications of trauma and the impact that has on someone's body and inflammation levels and autoimmunity. That's didn't change my opinion. It just gave me for a deeper respect to not overlook it. And then to chronic infections, it didn't change my opinion again. It's just something that I know for some people need a heavier hand. So people with Lyme disease, co-infections, mold toxicity, especially during COVID, I've seen this a lot since March of last year, that people are at home more. They're at one place for long periods of time. So if they're in a moldy space, I see these mold markers like never before. So that's forced me to not change my mind, but give it more attention and really focus on these heavier, deeper protocols for these people that need it. Not everybody needs that, but when it's clinically appropriate, we lean into it. So these aren't so much opinion changes, but just bigger attentions I have to give them to. And then I guess on social media, I really don't engage with people that are negative and toxic, but I guess I would randomly get caught up into it or look, but now I just don't even go there with people.
Good habit to have. With the mold and stuff like that, are you looking at using Great Plains mycotoxin, or what do you do to assess? And then what are the protocols you've been using?
Sure. So the Great Plains mycotoxin test is definitely one that we run. We don't always run that unless we see it clinically on a health history where it would be obvious, like they have a history of mold problems. They know they have a mold sensitivity. It's they see mold in their home and they smell it, et cetera. But that's not always the truth. So yes, sometimes the mycotoxin test is ran and as a first round. Oftentimes the mycotoxin test is ran as a second round to confirm the first round. So the first round tests are typically ones we do through insurance, or they're at least offset through insurance. So things like C4A, C3A, TGF beta 1, and MSH. Those are some conventional labs that we do. And then you can look at CD57 too, and kind of a lot of these things are great mimickers, they're great imitators of themselves. So we're looking at Lyme, co-infections to Lyme, mold, and then viral infections. These three things oftentimes mimic each other. So we have to look at the differential. So things like the mycotoxin test and Cyrex's multiple pathogen associated screening is a good test too, to look at things that could look like mold but aren't mold. And then from there, we determine the protocol. So blend of antimicrobials, detox supporters, biofilm disruptors, and then the saunas, something to support further detox pathways like infrared sauna.
Yeah. What about nutritionally?
Nutritionally, I mean, all the stuff we're really talking about, a clean ketogenic diet and fasting are great tools to support these detox pathways and get beta hydroxybutyrate doing its magic on our brain and on our detox pathways, on autophagy, on supporting mitochondrial biogenesis to make more resilient mitochondria, because these toxins are anathema to healthy mitochondria. So really, a lot of the food stuff that we've been talking in this conversation are protocols we lean into.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just so wild that it's such a common thing that people don't understand is pervasive. I mean, the exposure to, like you said, people are just inside all the time, and maybe in an environment like shouldn't exist. Like, should humans be living in the same box for a long time? And like this mold stuff is like, we get things that aren't supposed to be wet. Like everything should be technically wet in nature, but now we create environments that are so fragile that when they're disturbed at all, they create literal toxic things you can breathe in, that you can't see, you can observe. It's insane.
Right. And on top of that, I mean, it's the mold, and I find with some patients, it's not necessarily the cause of all their problems, but it's an amplifier on it, because there's already this fragility in their biochemistry. They're going through other health problems, and it was like the tipping point, the straw that broke the camel's back for them, where it's stressing out an already stressed out system. So it's a piece of the puzzle and needs to be looked at, because people that have cleaned up their diet, they're doing all the things, they're taking the right supplements, but they're still not getting where they need to go. That's most of my patients. They're kind of stuck at this plateau where they're probably, or most certainly, better off than they would be if they weren't doing all the things that they're doing. But there's still these missing pieces, and we can uncover these missing pieces so we can then deal with it and move forward. But you're absolutely right. We're living in these really unnatural circumstances in many ways, where we're breathing in the same air every day, or whatever you're talking about. I mean, this growing chasm between genetics and epigenetics is a problem for people. So we want to shorten that chasm as much as we can.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to see how much of the things we worry about in life right now are just due to humans living the way they're not built. I mean, even COVID and the pandemic, we wouldn't have had a pandemic 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, people wouldn't have, maybe it would have wiped out a reduced population in a very small place, or maybe it wouldn't even have evolved and gotten from a natural environment in the first place.
Yeah.
To chronic disease, I believe just a mismatch of our genes and our environment, and eating things that shouldn't be there and being exposed to certain things that shouldn't be in our environment. So it's just, it's curious for me all the time to think about what is possible right now to have sort of society exist as is. And it's like we have a certain society that's like founded on unnatural things, which is okay, I think. Like, how can we remove the biggest things that are making people sick? I'm actually going to Africa with Paul and a couple other people next month to stay with some tribes, some hunter-gatherer tribes. I'm just like so curious and just observing the way they live and trying to think about marrying, okay, here's their experience. Here's my experience in the US. Like, how can you pull some of this wisdom in and make it effortless for people who are living this lifestyle? It's hard. It's actually really difficult, especially like the larger a city you live in, the harder it gets. And this is something that I am glad I've seen this shift over the last 6 to 8 months of people who are getting out of larger cities and trying to find more remote things. They can work remote, so they're getting to be in more remote locales. I think it's good for people to be a little bit more rural instead of like being deep in the city.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if anything, in many ways, and we see glimpses of this over our lifetime, the fragility of our way of life and the price that we pay, and it comes with a cost, and many people are paying for it more than other people. But we're paying for it in the form of chronic health problems. We're paying for it in the level of autoimmune conditions. We're paying for it in a lot of disparity and disease in the world. And it didn't take much to start seeing the fragility in our way of life, economically, et cetera. And I think, we're going to, it's a matter of when, not if, we see more of that fragility, because it is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And who knows what that looks like? I don't know. But I just know it's not going to last forever. And people are going to have to start having a reckoning of how they're living their life and what's going to be sustainable for them.
Yeah. I mean, this is sort of like, I just always try to think about what is the truth underneath what I believe. And it's like interesting to see people who keep digging and digging and digging sort of like reach the same directionality. And it's like, okay, I was like into paleo type stuff for a while, then I led to keto. Like, this is not just me as an individual. It's like a whole group of people who have like individually came to a lot of these truths. And now I'm like really getting into regenerative agriculture. And there's just so many of these questions that once you start learning about this stuff, you realize like it's just such a simple word that I think is often undervalued, but the sustainability is something that must be talked about. And it's like, okay, well, can we do this? Do we have this many people? Can we feed this many people? Can we consume this much energy? The food system that we have that's just basically destroying our planet and destroying the food system at the same time? It's like, can we keep this up? The answer is absolutely not. And it's just bizarre to me how many people, I started reading all these books from like early 1900s all the way through now. There's a lot of people in this space who like figured all this stuff out over 100 years ago. I don't know if it's just pre-internet and nobody took it seriously, but like I'm learning about a lot of this stuff for the first time. And yet there's experts in the space who are like 80, 90 years old who are like, you guys have been saying this for literal like decades, many decades. Yeah. And yeah, it's just, I don't know, this is like a bizarre thing. Like, this is the tangents I go on now when I'm reading and when I'm learning about. Yeah. It's like, it's tough. I think I don't know where we go from here, but these are the problems that keep me up at night.
Yeah. I mean, these are important things. They're existential issues, but they're really not so existential. I mean, they're really practical things. And I think, I think what you're doing right now, this next phase of what you're focused on, is really the future. We have to look at our food. We have to look at the sustainability of it. And I think regenerative farming, without a doubt, is such an essential part of that. And those people that you said 80, 90 years ago, 100 years ago, were saying about this stuff, they're being validated. And still, there's so much education that has to go around it. Most of the world doesn't even understand what you are what we're talking about, but they're going to be forced to learn about it, I think, sooner or later.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a collapse some point in the future, whether it's 50 years from now or 500 years from now. It's coming. Like, what we're doing is quite literally unsustainable. I mean, I would just like to have it be a lower collapse than a larger collapse.
Yeah,
I think about it. Yeah. I mean, like, we're not going to be able, like, anytime we've tried to, it's this weird conundrum that we've had since we started agriculture, essentially. And like, as we've condensed and harnessed more energy, we've been able to feed more people. Those people have more kids, and then we have a higher pressure to feed more people. So we find technologies that can extract more to feed those people. Those people have more kids, and then we have more people. And it's just like this never-ending cycle. And the question is always, well, how are we going to feed X amount of people? And the question I have is like, why do we have so many people? Like, there's this term in agriculture for land, it's called carrying capacity of acreage. It's like, okay, if I have 200 acres, what's the carrying capacity for, whatever species of cattle? And if you go over that carrying capacity, the ecosystem crumbles and the carrying capacity plummets. And the question I sort of ask at times is like, what is the carrying capacity for humans on planet Earth? And I think we're far past that point. And it's like, you can't just keep extracting without expecting that carrying capacity to plummet past where the normal, like, nature's set carrying capacity is. And that's just the reality of where we're heading. And I think that it's sort of frightening.
Yeah, I know. It is. It's crazy when you look at the statistics and the fragility of it all. But there's people like you that are asking these questions, the people that are really digging into, at least, like you said, what are the biggest problems? What's the way to decrease the collapse so it's not such an extreme collapse? I think that's the best thing we can be looking for. Yeah.
Bring it back to fasting real quick before we wrap up. I'm just curious on your opinion about multi-day fasts.
Yeah. So I think multi-day fasts are an amazing tool. We work on it with patients. That's not what I'm exploring in the book. I want this to be flexible and approachable and for people to explore different eating windows and cycle through these vacillating, I call it in the book, these like a proverbial yoga class for their metabolism. So they can go deeper and expand and contract these fasting and eating windows, because I've seen it move the needle profoundly in people's biochemistry. But deeper long fasts, which I touch upon in the book and I talk about, it's probably for most people, I would say, to have a functional medicine practitioner, have some sort of coach or guidance through that to see if it's clinically appropriate or if it's something that would benefit from. But yeah, I mean, for people that have more chronic health problems, people that have severe digestive problems, people that have severe autoimmune problems, people that have cancer, I mean, these are protocols that people can lean into. And that's not to say you have to have a chronic health problem to do multi-day fasts. I mean, I do them as well. But they're definitely not for everybody. They have their place, but not for everybody.
What does your multi-day fast look like?
3-day water fast, electrolytes. So that's basically what it is, just a water fast. I've never done long dry fasts. But
they're intense.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I know people that do them, but yeah, I just do water fasts, a couple days, and then I'm done. Like I don't do them that often. I do time restricted feeding daily, but they're more of like a occasional seasonal thing that I'll do.
Yeah, I haven't tested my labs with dry fast versus water fasting, but it certainly feels like 2 days in, 3 days into a dry fast, it feels like 7 days into a water fast. It makes sense. You have to speeding up autophagy to start actually giving the water to cells.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'd say that there's probably more historical precedent set for dry fasting than water fasting.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't have any actual data to back that up. So it seems like that would have made sense in the past.
Definitely. From an ancestral health perspective, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool, Doc. Well, where can people find your new book and all the other stuff you're up to?
Thanks, man. Yeah, everything's at drwillcole.com. That's drwillcole.com.
Easy. Cool.
Just my name.
Thanks for round 3, brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research in books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing, and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.